At this point, we've implemented almost everything from Redux into the React application except for those date filters. So that is exactly what we're going to focus on in this one. And once again, we're going to be using that React dates library. So we can pull up the documentation for that one more time. If you remember, React dates has the single date picker and it also has a range picker. This time around, we're going to be using the range picker. So if we do scroll down, we can go ahead and take a look at that. The component is date range picker, and it allows us to pick a start date and an end date, which is exactly what we want. We want the user on this page to be able to limit what they're seeing between two different dates. Now to get this done, we are going to make changes to a few files. Let me kick things off by just closing all of the files. First up, we are going to be using app.js. We are also going to be using the expense list filters file. This is where we're going to be adding the calendar picker. We also need the expenses selectors file. We're going to be changing the logic just on these two lines to work with the new system. And the final one that we're going to be using is the filters reducer. We're also going to be making some changes to the default value for start date and end date to actually work with what the React dates component expects. So let's go ahead and start off right here actually. What we're going to do is change the default value for start date and end date. What I want to do is default to just showing expenses from the current month. So we want the start date to be at the beginning of the current month, and we want the end date to be at the end of the current month. First up, we are going to be importing moment, import moment from moment, and that's going to make it really easy to calculate what those values should be. So what should be the start of the month? What should be the end of the month? Now we're also going to be switching up start date and end date to be moment instances as opposed to numbers. So right here, we are going to create a new instance of moment, not passing anything in, which means it will be the current moment in time when the actual line runs. Then we're going to use a method available to us called start of. Now there's start of and there's its counterpart end of, and we can find both of these over in the moment documentation. We can head over to momentjs.com. We're going to go over to the docs page. We're going to go over to manipulate, and right here we have start of time and end of time. So we can see we can go to the start of the year, the month, the quarter, the week, the day, the hour, all of those units, and we can do the exact same thing for end of. So what do we want to do? Well, right here, we want to go to the start of the month. So I want to limit it to just seeing expenses in the current month. So the start date should be the start of the month and the end date is going to be the end of the month. So we'll call moment again, creating a new instance, and we will shift it over to the end of, and here we're trying to go to the end of the month. If we wanted to see all of the expenses from the current year, we could switch this over to the start of the year and the end of the year, but I am going to stick with month to just limit the amount of expenses a user is seeing at one time. Now that's the only change we need to make for the filters file. Everything else is going to stay exactly the same. We're just going to set up those defaults. So we can go ahead and save this one and continue on. What I'd like to do next is actually wire up the date range picker. So that's going to live over here in expense list filters, and we're going to toss it down at the bottom. So we have our text search, we have our drop down for sorting, and then at the very bottom, you'll be able to pick the range of dates you want to be able to see expenses for. Now, how are we going to get this done? First up, let's check out the docs right here. We can see that date range picker takes 5 props. The other one we used, the single date picker, took 4, and the big difference is just that we have 2 dates getting passed in. So everything else is the same. We still have a function that runs when the dates change, and we still need to keep track of the focus input. So we're going to be providing those 2 values just like we did in the past. Let's go ahead and actually kick this off, and we're going to need to make a change to the filters component. We are going to need to add a little bit of state in to track this value. So we're actually going to switch this over to a class-based component. Now it's perfectly fine if you find you need to switch from one type of component to the other. There's nothing wrong with that. All we're going to do is get it done by creating a class. So class expense list filters. This one is going to extend using extends react.component. And to start off, the goal is to just replace the existing behavior. So I'm going to take the JSX that we were returning. I'm going to cut it out. I will delete the stateless functional component, and I'm going to toss it right here in render. So I'll set up the render method, and I will return the JSX that I just copied. Now, if we go ahead and save things, we have exactly what we had before. The only difference is that now we can actually add a little bit of state. There's just one thing we need to track right here. We can set up state setting it equal to an object, and we can track that one thing. We're going to call this the exact same thing we called it for the expense form page. So if you remember here, we kept track of calendar focused. We need to do that over here as well. Calendar focused. This one is actually going to start off at null. It's not going to be just true or false. It is going to be null for us, or it is going to be a string. So it's going to be a string if we're focused on the first of the two calendars or the second. Now, once again, we don't need to do anything with this. We just need to keep track of it and pass it down into the React dates component. So we have the default state set up for this, and now we can go ahead and actually import the component that we're going to be using. Import date range picker, and we're going to be grabbing that from React dates. So now that we have the import set up, we can start setting it up down below. Just below select, I'm going to go ahead and create an instance of it, date range picker. And we are going to add those 5 necessary props, and then we'll add on a few other ones just for fun. So to kick things off, we want to set up the start date right here. Start date. The start date is going to be an instance of a moment, and we actually already have that. We just changed the default value for the filters to be a moment, start date and end date, which means that all we have to do is access it. I'm going to set start date equal to, right here, we have this dot props dot filters. Then we're going to access start date. Now remember, we just made some pretty big changes from a stateless functional component to a class-based component. So we're trying to use props here, and that's not going to exist. We need this dot props dot filters dot text. We have to do the exact same thing in a few other places. Right here, for example, we use props, and then we just have 3 more down below. We have the filter props for sort by. Then we have 2 more dispatch calls. So now that we are correctly grabbing all of the props, we can continue on. After start date, we're going to have end date, and that is also going to get its value off of the filters object. This dot props dot filters dot end date. Perfect. There are just 3 more required ones. The next one for us is going to be what we do when the dates change. We're going to define a method up above for that, but we can set it up down here first. The actual prop is on dates change, and we're going to set it up to reference the method, this dot, and we can call it whatever we like. I'll just stick with the same name, on dates change. Now we are going to need to define that, and we will do that right up above. On dates change is going to equal an arrow function. Now this function is going to get called by the React dates library. It's going to get called with an object, and on that object we're going to have a start date and an end date. So we could just create a variable and pull those off, or we could just destructure that object, grabbing both start date and end date. Now that we have the new values, all we need to do is actually dispatch the correct actions to get the filters to change. And for us, we have those. We have on filters, first up, set start date. And second up, we have set end date. All we have to do is import both of those and actually use dispatch. So right here, this.props.dispatch. And we're going to go through the process of dispatching both actions. And there's no need for any conditional logic in here. So all we have to do is call set start date. What are we going to pass in? We're going to pass in the new start date. So right here, I'll just pass that in. And then we're going to do the exact same thing for setting the end date. So this.props.dispatch, set end date, and we are going to go ahead and pass it in. Now this is actually all done. We're not quite done. We can't save the file. We're still missing some props, but we're getting very close. So next up, we have to pass in focused input. And this is where the state we're tracking up above comes into play. So I'm going to get its value from this dot state dot. Then we have the thing we set up, calendar focused. The last thing we have to do is provide the change handler. So that is called on focus change. As we can see right over here, on focus change is going to get the focused value, and then they just set it, and we're going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to create a method for that. This dot on focus change. and we can define it up above. Now, once we define this, we're actually going to have a valid usage, and we'll be able to mess around with it in the browser. First up, let's go ahead and set that missing method up on focus change. We are going to set it equal to an arrow function. And we know this arrow function gets the new value, and we just set it. So we can call that new value calendar focused, for example, making our set state call a little bit easier. So this dot set state, we can pass in that updater function. We can define the changes we want to make by implicitly returning an object. We have to wrap it in parentheses, don't forget. And then all we're going to do is set calendar focused equal to the new value right here. We can use the shorthand for that, calendar focused. Perfect. Now we have a completely valid usage of date range picker. If we save the project though, we're going to get into some pretty weird stuff pretty soon. So let's go ahead and just see what we get. Over here, we have everything and it's looking pretty good. I have the first of the month over here and I have the last of the month over here, which is exactly what we were hoping for. And I can go ahead and change them. So I can go ahead and change it. Let me take us from the 1st to something like the 8th. And then I'll go from the 8th to the 11th, and we can see all of that shows up. Now, obviously, our filters aren't working at all. That's why we're going to be changing that file. But there is a couple other problems. First off, we don't have a way to go back in time once again, and we're also seeing multiple calendars. So just like we did before, we can add a few nice-to-have options. We're going to add those on right here before we go any further. We're going to add number of months, something we've already explored before, and we're just going to limit it to 1 month visible at a time. And we're also going to define that is outside range prop. And this is something that we also did inside of expense form. We defined it way below at the bottom. Right here is outside range. Remember, we just returned false every single time. That is exactly what we're going to do in here. Create the arrow function, implicitly return false. So now what's left? There's just one more thing I want to add that's specific to date range picker, and it's the ability to clear those dates with a little X button over here. And we can set that up. It's one of the props defined down below. This one is show clear dates. Show clear dates is false by default. That means we don't show the clear dates button. If we switch it over to true though, we are going to see that button, and that's going to be something that I am going to enable. Now you could choose to customize this to fit your personal preferences, but I do find it nice to be able to quickly just show all of the expenses clearing the dates. If I do refresh the page, we can bring those dates back. Now, all of this is set up, and that's great, but there is a problem, which is that the filtering has no effect. Right here, we have some expenses created in basically 1969 and 1970, and they're showing up for our filter over here. So we have to go ahead and change how we're filtering, because remember, in the past, we had values for start date and end date, which were numbers, which means that over here, we were using things like greater than or equal to and less than or equal to. That's no longer going to work for us. So what we're going to do is use some really nice moment methods to refactor just these two lines. Then everything will be working as expected. First up, we need a way to actually make these comparisons with Moment. Moment does have some methods available to us. So right here, we used to use the greater than or equal to for numbers. What we're going to be using is the query methods for Moment. So right here, we have a lot of different ways we can compare two dates. Is one before another? Are they the same? Is one after another? And if we just look at one of these examples, it's really not too bad. So right here, we have October 20th, 2010. Is that before October 21st, 2010? Yes, it's a day before, so we get true back. All of these methods return either true or false, and that's going to be really handy for us. The ones that we're going to be using are is same or before, and is same or after. We're going to be using is same or before for start date match, and is same or after for end date match. So let's go ahead and actually knock this out. I'm going to start by deleting everything from both of these variables. So we're going to be building up those lines from scratch. First up, we want to check if there is even a start date. We gave the user an option to clear those dates, so we're going to check first. We can use the ternary operator. Start date, yes or no. If yes, we'll do one thing. If no, we'll do something else. If there is no start date, we're never going to actually filter things out based off of that, so we'll return true. Start date match will always be true if there is no start date. Now, if there is one, what do we want to do? We want to use is same or before. So we're going to take start date, and we're going to check if it is the same or before some other value. Now, what is that other value? That other value is the created at value. Now we can actually just create a new moment instance based off of expense.createdAt, and we can pass that in right here. So what are they using over here? They're using just little text-based timestamps, but up above you can see we have the option to pass moment instances in, and that's the thing that we're going to take advantage of right here. Const created at moment. We're going to create a new moment, and we're going to be creating that from the value of expense.createdAt. Now, since we are starting to use moment in this file, it's probably a good idea to also import it. We can do that up at the very top. Import moment from moment. So we have our created at moment, and what we're going to do is check if start date is the same or before this one. We'll just pass it in, created at moment. And they even give us another argument we can pass in. So over here, we can pick a string, and this allows us to define the unit. So is this the same year or before? And that can be useful for some people. In our case, we want to check if it's the same day or before. So right here, as a second argument, we will pass in day. And that is all we're going to do for start date match to get everything to work as expected. All we have to do is the exact same thing for end day match. So end date. Then we're going to go ahead and use the ternary operator. Once again, if there is no end date, we're never going to filter out based off of that. So we'll have true be the value. If there is one, we want to go ahead and actually do something with it. So end date dot is the same or after. And what are we going to pass in? We're going to pass in those exact same two arguments, the created at moment and the day. So we're going to check both of those. If they're both true, then the expense will be kept. If either are false, the expense will go away. Now we can save the expenses file, and we can take a look at what's going to happen in the expenses page. So what do we have? We have absolutely nothing. If we go ahead and clear the filter, what do we get? We get all of our expenses showing up, which is great. Now let's go ahead and actually create a new expense and try to mess around with that. So I'm going to create a couple of expenses. I will have this one be on the first of the month, and I'll give it an amount of whatever. I'm just going to put in $100. Now I'm going to change the date over to the first of the month, and there's no need for a note. I add the expense and it does show up, which is great. It should. Now I'm also going to add one for the 31st of the month. Another one, 31st of month, an amount of whatever, $0, and then I'll change the date over to the 31st. I'm going to add that expense, and that expense does show up, which is great. And it is indeed showing up in the correct order as well, since we are sorted by date. From here, we can change the date range. So maybe I want to check between the 2nd and the 4th. We have no expenses there, so I would expect none to show up. If I change it from the 1st to the 3rd, we have one match shows up. If I go into the past, like July 1st to August 1st, once again, we just have one guy showing up. So by setting up the date range picker, we're going to be able to filter our expenses via this calendar widget. And that's going to make searching and navigating our expenses much, much easier. We now have two ways to filter. We can filter by date and by description, and we have one way to sort. We can choose to sort by the date or by the amount. So that's where we're going to wrap it up for this video and for this section. We've integrated every single Redux feature into the React application. All of the expense-related actions, all of the filter-related actions, we're actually able to use them inside of our application, which is just fantastic. Now, let's take a quick moment to recap before we go. In this one, we needed to make some changes to how we manage start date and end date, those filters. In the past, they were numbers. These days, since we're using the React dates picker, we're going to have them be moment instances. So the start date is the start of the month, the end date is the end of the month, and then we actually set up the date range picker. We passed in those two dates on change, we changed them, and then we added a little bit of customization as well. So we were able to add the ability to clear the dates, to just view 1 month, and to actually be able to pick dates in the past. The last thing we changed was inside of our expenses selector file. In here, we had to change how we compared the values. So we went from numbers to moment instances. Over here, we had to go from comparing numbers to comparing moment instances. That is it for this one. I will see you in the next video.